The day I discovered construction equipment tearing up my 100-year-old oak trees was the day I learned exactly how far some people will push their luck when they think nobody is watching. I had been living in Portland, Oregon for work when I inherited my grandfather's 200 acres of pristine forest land in Cascade County. The property was beautiful, untouched wilderness that backed up against the Pine Ridge Estates, a wealthy gated community that had sprung up about 15 years ago. My grandfather, Owen Turner, had been smart enough to negotiate an easement agreement with the development back then, allowing them access to a narrow strip of land on the western edge of my property, so they could build a road connecting their back entrance to the county highway. In exchange, they paid him a modest annual fee and promised to maintain the road. When he passed away 6 months ago, that easement transferred to me, along with everything else. I had planned to move back permanently in a few weeks, but something told me to drive up from Portland that Tuesday morning in early March. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was the weird voicemail from my neighbor, Eddie, who lived on the adjacent property to the north. His message had been garbled, something about seeing trucks on my land, but the connection cut out before he could finish. The moment I turned onto the old logging road that led to my property, I knew something was wrong. Fresh tire tracks scarred the muddy ground, and I could hear machinery in the distance. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my truck tighter as I drove deeper into the forest. What I found made my blood boil. At least 6 bulldozers were systematically clearing trees on the eastern section of my property, the area farthest from the road easement. Massive oaks and Douglas firs that had stood for generations lay toppled like matchsticks. Beyond the destruction, I could see surveying stakes with bright orange flags marking out what looked like fairways and greens. They were building a golf course on my land. I slammed on my brakes and jumped out of my truck, marching toward the nearest bulldozer. The operator saw me coming and shut down his machine. He was a weathered guy in his 50s with a hard hat and confused expression. "Who authorized this?" I shouted over the noise of the other machines. "The HOA, buddy. We got all the permits and everything. This is Pine Ridge property." "The hell it is. This is my property. I am Owen Turner, and you are currently destroying my forest." The color drained from his face. He pulled out a rolled set of plans from his cab and spread them across the hood of a nearby pickup truck. I could see the survey lines clearly marked, and they definitely showed this section as belonging to Pine Ridge Estates. "Someone gave you the wrong information," I said, pulling out my phone. "I have the property documents right here in my cloud storage. This is 200 acres, and you are at least 300 feet onto my side of the property line." The foreman of the crew had walked over by this point, a stocky man named Rodriguez according to his badge. He looked at my documents, then at his plans, and his face went pale. "Shut it down," he called to his crew. "Everyone stop work now." Within minutes, the forest fell silent except for the settling sounds of damaged trees and displaced earth. Rodriguez was on his phone, speaking rapidly in Spanish, then in English to someone else. I could hear him saying things like "major problem" and "wrong property" and "legal nightmare." 20 minutes later, a silver Mercedes SUV came barreling down the path, kicking up mud and nearly sideswiping my truck. Out stepped a woman who looked like she had just come from a country club luncheon. She was probably in her late 40s, with aggressively highlighted blonde hair, designer sunglasses, and an expression that suggested she had never heard the word no in her entire life. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, not even looking at me. "Rodriguez, why has work stopped? Do you have any idea how far behind schedule we already are? Mrs. Patterson, we have a situation," Rodriguez said carefully. I do not want to hear about situations. I want to hear about solutions. The spring gala is in 6 weeks, and the board promised everyone a preview of the new golf course. Now get back to work. Madam, this is not our property, I said, stepping forward. She looked at me for the first time, her eyes scanning me from head to toe with obvious disdain. I was wearing jeans, work boots, and an old flannel shirt, nothing like the polo and khakis uniform I had noticed on the men working security at the Pine Ridge entrance. And who are you? Owen Turner. I own this land, all of this land, and you have just destroyed about 5 acres of old-growth forest without my permission. Brenda Patterson, as I would come to know her, was the president of the Pine Ridge Estates HOA board. She had held the position for 8 years running, ruling the community with an iron fist and a thick book of regulations that governed everything from mailbox colors to the exact height of grass in front yards. That is impossible, she said flatly. This land was sold to Pine Ridge 3 months ago. We have the documentation. Then you have fraudulent documentation, because I never sold anything to anyone. I inherited this property from my grandfather 6 months ago, and the title is clear and recorded with the county. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Linda, I need you to bring the purchase documents for the eastern parcel to the construction site immediately. Yes, I know you are at lunch. This is more important. We stood in uncomfortable silence for the next 15 minutes. I used the time to take dozens of photos of the damage, making sure to capture the survey stakes, the destroyed trees, and the property line markers that were still visible at the northern edge of the clearing. A red BMW pulled up, and a thin woman in her 30s hopped out with a leather folder. This was Linda, apparently the HOA secretary. She handed the folder to Brenda, who opened it triumphantly. Here, she said, thrusting a document at me. Purchase agreement for 200 acres, signed and notarized. I looked at the document. The signature read Owen Turner, but it was not my signature. The notary stamp was from someone named Patricia Holloway in Cascade County. The date was from December, 3 months ago. This is forged, I said simply. That is not my signature, and I was never contacted about any sale. Do not be ridiculous. Why would anyone forge a property sale? That is an excellent question. Maybe because your HOA wanted to build a golf course and I was not around to tell you no. Brenda's face flushed red. How dare you accuse the Pine Ridge HOA of fraud? We are pillars of this community. We have lawyers' connections. If there is some kind of identity theft situation here, that is your problem, not ours. Actually, it is very much your problem since you have been operating heavy equipment and destroying protected trees on property that does not belong to you. I suggest you pack up and leave before I call the sheriff. The sheriff, she laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. The sheriff plays golf with my husband. Good luck with that. But Rodriguez and his crew were already packing up their equipment. Whatever they were being paid was not worth getting caught in the middle of a property dispute that could turn into criminal charges. We are done here, Rodriguez said. Mrs. Patterson, you need to sort this out with your lawyers before we do any more work. I am not touching this property again until I see clear title. Brenda tried to argue, but Rodriguez was firm. His crew left within the hour, leaving behind the devastation and an increasingly angry HOA president. This is not over, Brenda said to me. I will have my lawyers contact you. And you will discover that fighting Pine Ridge Estates is not something people win. She stormed off to her Mercedes and drove away, leaving Linda scrambling to follow in her BMW. I called the Cascade County Sheriff's Office that afternoon and filed a report. Deputy Marcus Chen came out to document the damage and take my statement. He was professional and thorough, photographing everything and taking copies of my property documents. "This is pretty cut and dry," he said. "If that purchase agreement is forged, this is criminal trespass, destruction of property, and fraud. Possibly conspiracy if multiple people were involved." The HOA president seemed pretty confident that nothing would happen, I said. Deputy Chen's expression hardened. "A lot of people think money and connections put them above the law. It does not. I will forward this to detectives, and they will investigate the notary and the document. In the meantime, I would suggest putting up no trespassing signs and maybe some cameras if you can. People like this sometimes double down when confronted." He was right to be concerned. 2 days later, I drove up from Portland again after Eddie called to say he had seen trucks on my property. When I arrived, I found a survey crew placing new stakes, this time along what they claimed was the correct property line, which conveniently placed all the cleared area inside Pine Ridge territory. I confronted them immediately. "Who hired you?" The surveyor, a nervous young man named Josh, showed me a work order from Pine Ridge Estates HOA. "We are just doing our job, sir. They said there was a dispute about the property line and needed an official survey." "Using whose property records?" "Theirs, I guess." "Look, if you have different documentation, you need to take it up with them. We just go where we are told." I spent the next hour walking the actual property line with Josh, showing him the original survey markers from my grandfather's survey 20 years ago. These were permanent brass markers set in concrete, the kind that do not lie. Every single one of them showed that Pine Ridge's survey was off by 300 to 400 feet. To his credit, Josh was honest. "Sir, these are legitimate survey markers. I do not know what documents they gave us, but they are wrong. This is definitely your property." He packed up his crew and left, but not before giving me copies of the fraudulent survey Pine Ridge had provided him, more evidence for the growing case file. That evening, I got a call from a lawyer named Gregory Martinez, who claimed to represent Pine Ridge Estates HOA. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of lawyer who was used to intimidating people into backing down. "Mr. Turner, I understand there has been some confusion about property boundaries. My clients are willing to make you a generous offer to purchase the disputed parcel and avoid lengthy litigation." "There is no dispute and nothing is for sale," I said. "Your clients forged documents to steal my property and destroyed about 20 trees that were over 100 years old. I am not interested in making a deal. I am interested in pressing charges." "That would be unwise," Martinez said, his tone cooling. "Litigation is expensive and time-consuming. And frankly, you are one person going up against a well-funded homeowners association with deep pockets. Even if you are right, we can drag this out for years. Be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. Get off my property and pay for the damage." "We will see you in court, Mr. Turner." He hung up. I immediately called my own lawyer, a property attorney in Portland named Sarah Chen, who had helped me with the inheritance paperwork. She listened to everything and asked me to send her all the documentation. "This is insane," she said when I finished. "They forged a deed." "That is not a civil matter, Owen. That is criminal fraud. But the lawyer is right about one thing: they can make this expensive and slow even though you are clearly in the right." "So what do I do?" "Document everything. Cooperate with the sheriff's investigation. And do not, under any circumstances, let them intimidate you into a settlement. People like this count on their victims being too tired or too poor to fight back." The next week was a blur of legal paperwork and phone calls. The detective assigned to the case, Rebecca Walsh, was thorough and skeptical in equal measure. She tracked down the notary, Patricia Holloway, who worked at a small office supply store in town. Patricia was horrified when confronted with the forged document. I never notarized that. That is my stamp, but I keep it locked in my desk. Someone must have stolen it. When asked about security footage, the store manager revealed that they had cameras but only kept footage for 30 days. The document was dated too far back. However, Patricia did remember a blonde woman coming in asking about notary services in December, around the time the document was dated. She had not needed anything notarized in the end, just asked questions about the process. Patricia could not remember her name, but the description matched Brenda Patterson perfectly. Meanwhile, Pine Ridge Estates was moving forward with their golf course construction on their actual property, but the loss of my parcel had apparently thrown off their entire design. The original plan had the signature 18th hole running through the now inaccessible old-growth forest on my land, with the clubhouse positioned to overlook it. I learned this from Eddie, who had a friend who worked maintenance at Pine Ridge. According to the inside gossip, Brenda had promised the community a championship-level course designed by some famous golf course architect. Losing access to my property meant major redesigns and cost overruns. Good. In early April, I got a call from a different number. This time it was a man's voice, older and more authoritative. "Mr. Turner, this is Robert Patterson, Brenda's husband. I think we got off on the wrong foot here. I would like to invite you to dinner to discuss this situation like reasonable adults." I had heard about Robert Patterson. He was a retired investment banker who sat on several corporate boards and was known around Cascade County as a major donor to political campaigns. The kind of man who expected his money to open any door and solve any problem. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a steakhouse in town called the Timber Lodge. Sarah advised me to record the conversation if Oregon law allowed it. It did, with one-party consent, so I made sure my phone was ready. Robert Patterson was in his 60s, silver-haired and tan, wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than my truck payment. He greeted me with a firm handshake and an appraising look. "Thank you for coming," he said as we sat down. "I appreciate a man willing to talk business." "I am not sure what business we have to discuss," I said. "Your wife's HOA destroyed my property based on fraudulent documents." He held up a hand. "I am not going to defend what happened. It was clearly a miscommunication that got out of hand, but I am a practical man, Mr. Turner. You have something we need, and I am prepared to make it worth your while." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a check for $500,000. "That is for 50 acres of your property, the section that was being cleared. That comes out to $10,000 per acre, which is well above market value for raw forest land in this area. You can keep the rest of your property. We will adjust our golf course design, and everyone walks away happy. You think you can pay me off after trying to steal my land? I think we can resolve this misunderstanding before lawyers get even richer than they already are," he said smoothly. "Look, I know Brenda can be intense. She is passionate about the community, sometimes too passionate. But I have looked into the situation, and I believe someone on the administrative staff made an honest mistake with the property records. No one was trying to defraud you. An honest mistake that involved forging my signature and using a stolen notary stamp." His smile faltered slightly. "The sheriff's investigation is ongoing. I am confident it will show that any documentation issues were the result of clerical errors, not criminal intent. But regardless of how we got here, we still have a problem. You have land we need, and we are prepared to pay fairly for it. And if I say no, then we all spend the next 2 years in court. You spend whatever money you have on lawyers, and even if you win, you will probably get less than what I am offering you now after legal fees. Why put yourself through that?" I looked at the check. $500,000 was a lot of money, more than I made in 3 years at my job in Portland. It was tempting, which was exactly why he had made the offer so large. "No," I said, sliding the check back across the table. "My grandfather loved this land. He spent his whole life protecting it. I am not selling it to be turned into a golf course, especially not to people who tried to steal it first." Robert's friendly demeanor evaporated. "You are making a mistake." "Maybe, but it is my mistake to make." I left the restaurant feeling both proud and terrified. I had just turned down $500,000 and declared war on some of the wealthiest people in the county. The retaliation started within days. First, I received a notice from the Pine Ridge Estates, HOA, that they were terminating the easement agreement my grandfather had signed. The access road that cut through my property to connect their back entrance to the county highway would be closed, and they would be removing the improvements they had made to the road. This was interesting for 2 reasons. First, the easement agreement explicitly stated it could only be terminated by mutual consent or if the annual fee went unpaid. Second, Pine Ridge actually needed that road far more than they realized. I called Sarah immediately. "Can they do this?" "Absolutely not," she said. "That easement is a recorded legal agreement. They cannot just terminate it because they are mad at you. But honestly, Owen, why do you care? Let them close the road if they want." "Because I think they are bluffing," I said. "That road is not just for convenience. Let me do some research." I spent that evening digging through county records and planning documents. What I discovered was fascinating. When Pine Ridge Estates was originally developed, the County Planning Commission had required them to have 2 points of access for emergency services. The main entrance off Pine Valley Road was one. The back entrance through my property was the other. If they closed that back entrance, they would be in violation of their occupancy permit. The whole development could technically be declared uninhabitable until they established a compliant secondary access point. I called Sarah back. "Do not respond to their termination notice yet. I want to see if they actually follow through." 2 weeks went by. Then one morning, I drove up to check on the property and found a crew removing the gravel and culverts from the access road. They had already torn up about half a mile of road, leaving deep ruts and mud. I took pictures and videos of everything, then called the Cascade County Planning Department. The woman I spoke with, Jennifer, was very interested in what I had to tell her. "They are removing their secondary access," she said. "That would put them in violation of their development permit. Let me look into this and call you back." An hour later, my phone rang. It was Jennifer, and she sounded stressed. "Mr. Turner, I just got off the phone with the Pine Ridge HOA, and they claim they have approval for a new secondary access point through a different route. But when I asked for the documentation, they said it was still being processed." "That is not how this works. What happens now? I am sending an inspector out tomorrow. If they do not have a compliant secondary access, I will have to issue a notice of violation. They will have 30 days to fix it. And if they do not, then technically, the county can revoke their occupancy permit until they comply. Though I have never seen it actually come to that. Usually, people fix these things once they understand the consequences." I thanked her and hung up. Then I did something I had been thinking about for days. I sent a formal notice to Pine Ridge Estates, HOA, exercising my right as the property owner to revoke the easement agreement due to their breach of the annual payment terms. They had stopped paying the easement fee the moment they believed they had purchased my property. It was only $3,000 a year, but it was enough to trigger the termination clause. And since they had already started destroying the road, I was just making official what they had already begun. Sarah thought I was crazy. "Owen, You are escalating this. Are you sure you want to poke the bear? They poked first, I said, and I am tired of playing defense. The response was swift and furious. Gregory Martinez, the HOA lawyer, called me directly, his practiced calm completely gone. You cannot revoke that easement. We have rights under that agreement. You did have rights, but you stopped making the annual payments and you have been actively destroying the road improvements. Under Section 7 of the easement agreement, I have the right to terminate for material breach. Consider it terminated as of today. This is extortion. You are holding the entire community hostage because of a property dispute. No, I am enforcing my legal rights as a property owner. You tried to steal my land, failed, and then tried to terminate the easement yourselves. I am just finishing what you started. We will sue you into the ground, Martinez said. Get in line, I replied and hung up. The next few days were chaos. The Pine Ridge Estates community apparently had not been fully informed about the easement situation. When residents started receiving notices that the back entrance would be permanently closed, they began asking questions. The back entrance was not just for emergencies. It was the primary route for about 40% of the homes in Pine Ridge, the ones built on the eastern side of the development. Using only the main entrance added about 15 minutes to their commute because of the winding roads through the development. I started receiving calls and messages from Pine Ridge residents. Some were angry, threatening legal action. Others were confused, asking what was happening. A few were sympathetic once they heard the full story about the HOA trying to steal my land. One resident, a man named Tom Brennan, called me with an interesting proposition. Mr. Turner, I am on the HOA board and I was not part of any of this golf course nonsense. Half the board was not. This was Brenda's pet project, and she pushed it through with some creative interpretations of our bylaws. A lot of us are pretty angry about how this has been handled. That is between you and your HOA, I said. I know. But I wanted you to know that there is a special meeting being called next week to discuss the situation. Some residents are gathering signatures to recall Brenda and the other board members who approved the golf course. If you are willing to wait before taking any legal action regarding the easement, we might be able to sort this out with new leadership. What is the timeline? The recall requires signatures from 30% of homeowners, which we should have in a few days. Then there is a mandatory 30-day notice period before the recall election. If successful, new board members would be seated within a week after that. So realistically, maybe 6 weeks total. I thought about it. 6 weeks was not that long, and if the Pine Ridge residents wanted to clean house, that might actually lead to a real resolution. I will hold off on any further action regarding the easement, I said. But only if the HOA also agrees to stop all legal proceedings against me and stays off my property completely. And I want a formal apology and compensation for the damage to my land. I cannot promise anything, but I will bring it up at the meeting. The special HOA meeting was apparently legendary. I was not there, but Tom sent me a detailed email afterward. Over 200 residents showed up, packing the Pine Ridge clubhouse beyond capacity. Brenda tried to control the narrative, claiming I was a troublemaker trying to extort the community. But several board members, including Tom, broke ranks and revealed what had actually happened. They showed the forged documents, explained the property dispute, and detailed how Brenda had pushed the golf course project forward despite concerns about the cost and the legal issues. The room turned ugly fast. Residents were furious about being lied to, about the money being spent on lawyers, and especially about potentially losing their occupancy permit because of the easement situation. One resident, a retired lawyer named Patricia Summers, stood up and read from the HOA bylaws. It says here that the board must get approval from homeowners for any capital expenditure over $100,000. The golf course was budgeted at $4 million. When did we vote on that? Brenda tried to claim it fell under the board's authority to maintain and improve common areas, but no one was buying it. By the end of the meeting, recall petitions were circulating, and Brenda was screaming at people who had been her friends for years. The recall signatures were gathered within 3 days. The election was scheduled for early May. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation was progressing. Detective Walsh called me in for an interview in mid-April. She had been digging into the paper trail and found some interesting connections. The notary stamp that was used on the forged document was reported stolen from Patricia Holloway's desk in late November, she said. Patricia did not notice it missing until we started investigating because she does not use it that often. We pulled security footage from the weeks before it went missing. She showed me a grainy video of a woman entering the office supply store where Patricia worked. The woman was wearing sunglasses and a hat, but her body language and general build looked familiar. "Is that Brenda Patterson?" I asked. We cannot confirm identity from this footage alone, but we did find something else interesting. The forged purchase agreement was supposedly drafted by a lawyer named Martin Spencer. We contacted him, and he says he never drafted any such document. Someone used his name without permission. Another forgery. Exactly, and Martin Spencer's office is in the same building as the Pine Ridge Estates HOA office. We are looking into who had access to his letterhead and digital signature. That would be HOA staff, right? That is what we are thinking. Linda Morrison, the HOA secretary, is being brought in for questioning tomorrow, and we are getting a warrant to search the HOA offices. Things moved fast after that. The warrant was executed on a Thursday morning. Detective Walsh and 2 other officers spent 6 hours in the Pine Ridge HOA office, boxing up files and computers. Linda Morrison was questioned and apparently broke down within an hour, admitting that Brenda had ordered her to create the purchase documents. According to Linda's statement, Brenda had told her it was just to scare me into selling, that they were not actually going to use the forged documents. But when I had not responded to initial inquiries about selling the property, because I had been dealing with my grandfather's estate, Brenda had decided to move forward with the golf course construction anyway, using the fake papers to convince contractors it was legitimate. Linda had stolen the notary stamp herself, following Brenda's instructions. She had forged my signature using a copy of my signature from the inheritance documents that were on file with the county, and she had used Martin Spencer's letterhead from documents she had access to through the HOA office. It was conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and theft by deception. Brenda Patterson and Linda Morrison were both arrested on April 28th. The recall election became somewhat moot after that, though it proceeded anyway. Brenda was removed from the board by a vote of 387 to 12. 4 other board members who had supported the golf course project also lost their seats. Tom Brennan was elected as the new HOA president. His first official act was to call me. "Mr. Turner, on behalf of Pine Ridge Estates, I want to formally apologize for everything that has happened. What was done to you and your property was unconscionable. The new board would like to meet with you to discuss compensation and hopefully restore the easement agreement." We met at a neutral location, a conference room at the county library. The new board was 5 people, all of whom seemed genuinely embarrassed about the whole situation. Tom laid out their proposal. "We have conducted an assessment of the damage to your property. 23 old-growth trees were destroyed, along with significant damage to the forest floor and ecosystem. Our environmental consultant estimates it would cost approximately $200,000 to properly restore the area, though obviously some damage is permanent. We would like to offer you $300,000 in compensation, cover all your legal fees to date, and negotiate a new easement agreement at triple the previous annual rate. And the golf course, I asked, canceled. The project was financially unsound from the beginning, and it was based on using your property without permission. We will not be pursuing anything like that again. I looked at Sarah, who gave me a small nod. That seems fair, I said, but I want something else too. I want Pine Ridge to fund the creation of a conservation easement on my property that permanently protects it from development, and I want a formal written apology published in the community newsletter explaining what happened. Tom did not hesitate. Done. The settlement was finalized in June. I received a check for $300,000, plus another $40,000 for my legal fees. Pine Ridge funded a conservation easement through the Columbia Land Trust that ensured my 200 acres would remain undeveloped forever. And a detailed apology was published in the Pine Ridge newsletter, explaining how the previous board had broken the law and violated my rights. The road easement was restored with a new agreement that paid me $9,000 annually instead of $3,000. The road itself was professionally repaired by Pine Ridge, actually improved from its original condition. Brenda Patterson and Linda Morrison were charged with multiple felonies. Linda took a plea deal, testifying against Brenda in exchange for probation and community service. Brenda fought the charges but was convicted in September of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and theft by deception. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison and 5 years probation. Her husband Robert divorced her before she started serving her sentence. Apparently, he was more concerned about his reputation than standing by his wife. I moved back to the property permanently in July. Using the settlement money, I built a small cabin near my grandfather's old house and started working remotely for my Portland company. Eddie and I became good friends, often hiking the property together and documenting the recovery of the damaged forest section. The trees that were destroyed could not be replaced, not in my lifetime anyway. But I planted new saplings and worked with the Conservation Trust to develop a restoration plan. In 100 years, maybe someone else would walk through a forest of giants and never know what had happened here. The Pine Ridge community actually improved after the scandal. The new board was more transparent and responsive to residents. They dropped the contentious fines and rules that Brenda had imposed over the years, things like restrictions on holiday decorations and approved paint colors. The community became less about control and more about cooperation. Tom and I developed a friendly relationship. He would occasionally stop by to check on the easement road and chat about community issues. One afternoon in late summer, he brought over a 6-pack of local beer, and we sat on my porch watching the sunset. "You know," he said, "in a weird way, this whole mess might have saved our community. Brenda had become a tyrant, and nobody had the courage to stand up to her. You forcing the issue brought everything into the open." "I was just protecting my property," I said. "You were. But you also taught a lot of people a lesson about accountability. A lot of HOAs get away with abusive behavior because homeowners do not know their rights or are too intimidated to fight back. You fought back and you won." I thought about that. My grandfather used to say that standing up for what was right was often uncomfortable, but it was necessary. He had stood up to developers and loggers throughout his life to protect this land. I had just continued his legacy. In October, I got a letter from Patricia Holloway, the notary whose stamp had been stolen. She apologized profusely for not noticing the theft sooner and thanked me for pursuing justice. She had been terrified that she might lose her notary license or face legal consequences for the forged document, even though she was an innocent victim. The resolution of the case had cleared her name completely. I wrote back, assuring her I had never blamed her and appreciated her cooperation with the investigation. Small gestures, but important ones. The legal system had worked eventually. It had been slow and frustrating, but justice had been served. Brenda was in prison. Linda was on probation. My property was protected, and the community that had enabled the bad behavior had reformed itself. By November, the restored section of forest was showing signs of recovery. New growth was pushing up through the disturbed soil. Deer and elk that had avoided the area during construction were returning. It would take years, maybe decades, for the ecosystem to fully heal, but it was happening. I took regular walks through the property, often stopping at the spot where the old oak trees had stood. I mourned their loss, but I also took satisfaction in knowing that the rest of the forest was safe. The conservation easement meant that no future owner could ever develop this land. It would remain wild and protected forever. In December, almost a year after the forged documents had been created, I hosted a small gathering at my cabin. Sarah, my lawyer, was there. Tom and a few other Pine Ridge board members came. Eddie and his wife joined us. Detective Walsh stopped by briefly, pleased to see a case that had actually resulted in justice. We toasted to my grandfather, to protected lands, and to the importance of standing up for what was right. It had been an exhausting year, but a successful one. As winter settled over the Oregon forest, I felt a deep sense of peace. The land was safe. The wrongdoers had been punished, and I had honored my grandfather's legacy by fighting to protect what he loved. Sometimes I thought about Robert Patterson's offer, that check for $500,000. It had been tempting, incredibly tempting. I could have taken the money and walked away, let someone else deal with the headaches and legal battles. But some things are not for sale. Some things matter more than money. My grandfather had understood that, and now I did too. The forest was not just trees and dirt. It was history, ecology, legacy. It was a living connection to the past and a gift to the future. Fighting to protect it had been the right choice, even when it was difficult, even when I doubted myself. In the quiet evenings, sitting on my porch with a fire crackling in the wood stove, I would sometimes hear the wind moving through the old trees. It sounded like whispers, like conversations between generations. My grandfather's voice was in there somewhere, telling stories of the land, teaching lessons about stewardship and responsibility. I had learned those lessons the hard way, through conflict and confrontation. But I had learned them, and the land was better for it. The Pine Ridge Estates community had learned lessons too. Their newsletter now regularly featured articles about property rights, HOA governance, and the importance of ethical leadership. They had created new oversight mechanisms to prevent any single person from wielding too much power. And they had established a community scholarship fund, ironically using money that had been budgeted for the golf course, to support local students studying environmental science and law. Good things coming from bad situations. It was not redemption exactly, but it was growth. It was people recognizing their mistakes and choosing to do better. I continued working my remote job, but I also started volunteering with the Columbia Land Trust, helping other property owners establish conservation easements. My experience had taught me a lot about the legal processes and the challenges of protecting private land from development pressure. There were dozens of properties in Oregon facing similar threats. Maybe not fraud and forgery, but pressure from developers, from HOAs, from people who saw trees as obstacles rather than treasures. I could help those property owners understand their rights and options. In February, I gave a presentation at a land conservation conference in Eugene. I told my story, showed pictures of the damage and the recovery, explained the legal process. The room was packed with property owners, lawyers, conservationists, and activists. Afterward, at least 20 people came up to thank me or share their own stories. An elderly woman from Southern Oregon told me about her fight with a mining company. A young couple from the coast described their battle with a county planning commission. A lawyer from Portland asked if I would be willing to testify as an expert witness in a case he was working on. My story had become bigger than just me and my land. It had become a cautionary tale about power, greed, and the importance of standing firm. It had also become an inspiring tale about ordinary people fighting back against institutions and winning. I never sought out that role, never wanted to be a spokesman or activist. I just wanted to protect my grandfather's forest. But sometimes life pushes you into positions you did not expect, and you have to decide whether to accept the responsibility or walk away. I chose to accept it. By spring, a year after the arrests, I had helped 3 other property owners establish conservation easements. I had testified in 2 court cases about HOA overreach and property rights, and I had written an article for a state land use journal about the importance of clear title and the dangers of forged documents. The forest continued healing. The new saplings I had planted were thriving. The disturbed soil was stabilizing, and the rest of the 200 acres remained as beautiful and wild as ever. Tom called me in late April with interesting news. "You are not going to believe this, but a developer approached the HOA about buying some of our common land to build townhouses. The old board probably would have considered it, but we voted unanimously to reject the offer and actually establish our own conservation easement on the common areas. We realized that protecting open space is what makes Pine Ridge special, not developing every square foot." I smiled. "That is great news, Tom. We learned from the best," he said. Maybe that was the real victory, not the settlement money or the criminal convictions, but the change in thinking. People who had never thought about conservation or property rights were now passionate advocates. A community that had been complicit in fraud was now actively protecting the environment. Change is hard and slow, but it is possible. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, I thought about everything that had happened. The destruction, the anger, the legal battles, the fear. But also the resolution, the restoration, the justice, the hope. My grandfather had protected this land for decades. Now it was protected forever, legally and permanently. And the story of how it was saved would hopefully inspire others to protect their own wild places. The forest was quiet around me, peaceful in the twilight. Somewhere an owl called, and another answered. Night was falling, but it was a comfortable darkness, the kind that comes with security and rest. I had done what needed to be done. The land was safe, and that was enough.